So what I'm going to be covering today is really a high-level summary of some of the legal considerations that you as an employer and benefits teams need to be thinking about when you are considering vaccinations and vaccination-related policies. And I am a lawyer, but what we are going to go through today is not intended to be legal advice. So if you need legal advice on anything that I am raising, please contact your inside or outside counsel. Of course, if we can assist, we would be happy to do so. My contact information is there on that slide. Please feel free to reach out. And Sarah, we can go to the next slide. Folks, this is really largely uncharted legal territory, as has been for the last 12 months. I mean, talk about a wild ride. And so everything is continuing to emerge. And I think, I'll start with a takeaway, which is stay on top of the emerging developments that you can. And based on what's emerging, there really isn't one size that fits all for vaccination policies. So, as of right now, there is no law that expressly prohibits employers from mandating the vaccine. And as I mentioned on the slide before, there's a lot of good reasons to mandate it. Why does it matter if it's mandatory, encouraged? Well, if state legislation is passed, this is really going to inform what kind of policy you can put in place. And so throughout this presentation, I do want to encourage everyone to continue to be mindful of where your state is with respect to these issues and where your local government are with respect to these issues, so you can really determine if your employee-facing policy is in the right spot or not. And so you really want to make sure your managers and your human resources people are paying attention to these sort of potential legal minefields in navigating through the vaccination policies. So what would an employer do if an employee refuses to receive the vaccine because of one of these three areas: disability, pregnancy, or religious belief? You need to engage in an individualized assessment, just like any other interactive process requires an assessment based on that individual employee's facts and circumstances. That's what we call the individualized assessment. One thing I really want to underscore here is we cannot simply preclude somebody from the workplace because they refuse to get a vaccination, unless there is no other way to provide an accommodation to them and ensure that you are being mindful of any direct threat that they may pose. So what you want to do is you want to understand, what have you been doing so far, and is it working? So, for example, are there other mitigation strategies that you can deploy other than sending an employee home that are working? For example, could you reassign that person to a position within the company where they're not coming into contact with other people? Could they work from home? Could you, change their job duties such that they're not interacting maybe with the public if you are in an industry that has a public-facing operation? If you can substantiate a risk if they're not vaccinated, you have to consider these other accommodations before you can either require them to go on leave or even require them to work from home. So you really need to engage in this individualized assessment to determine if there's a way to keep them working and to keep them working at the job site unless there is an undue hardship or undue risk. You shouldn't short circuit this process and go right to termination. I've had some clients who are in this process right now and they say, well, Lisa, they refuse to be vaccinated and we have to have them vaccinated because we have them working in a lab and we can't have them working in a lab if they're not vaccinated, and so we want to terminate them. You got to press the pause button there and seek outside counsel, because you really can't short circuit this accommodation approach and go right to termination. So how do we operationalize all of this? It's difficult, and you really do need to work not only on the people side of the function, but work with your outside counsel on how to operationalize and how to come up with your policy on this. here is the checklist that I had mentioned at the beginning. It's fairly thorough. I'm sure there's other things that could be added to it, but we wanted to give you something to walk away with to at least start thinking about this process and all of the different parts and pieces of the puzzle that really need to be put in place before you roll out a policy. So I'm not going to go through all of those items, but you do have access to this and can request a copy of the slides. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention on incentives, and I forgot to mention this earlier. So incentives are employers paying the employees something or giving them some benefit if they receive a vaccination. And the EEOC proposed rules on group wellness programs, which was put into place in January, was almost immediately put on hold in February by the current administration. But what you want to pay attention to here is if you allow too high of an incentive, it may actually make the employee feel coerced to disclose a disability. And so you really, when you're thinking about a policy that is encouraged with incentives, the EEOC guidance, at least at this point, suggests that it really needs to be de minimis incentives. And do you know what they're calling a de minimis incentive? Water bottles. That's what they're thinking about with respect to de minimis incentives. So we're not talking about $100 bills here for incentives. So as you're putting together your policies, you do really want to make sure you are understanding the pay obligations that come along with requiring a vaccination. So, for example, maybe you are in a jurisdiction that has paid sick leave requirements. Dr. Basu mentioned a little bit about confidentiality in his presentation. I want to kind of bring us home with this concept as well. So if you're an employer and you are requiring your employees to become vaccinated, what kind of proof are you going to ask for, if any, that they have been vaccinated? Are you going to require some sort of vaccination card? And if you have requirements of this nature, who's going to have access to this information? And how will these records be maintained?